Hi everyone, Adriaan Groenewald, Leadership Platform. It's wonderful to be with you. As usual, I'm having one of my global leadership conversations, this time all the way in Australia, Melbourne. And my special guest is, let me get this right, Dina Pozzo in Melbourne, as I said. She's a facilitator, coach, speaker, but very much into courage, being courageous. She believes that she opens doors and invites people, you and I, to courageously open our doors to explore the other side. Now, who knows what's on the other side of me and you? And the truth is, maybe we need that other side to somehow cope and not just survive, but thrive in the current coronavirus world we find ourselves in. How amazing how this word, this concept of COVID-19 and coronavirus is part of our vocabulary. Our young kids talk about it. It is crazy. But I love talking to these experts all over the world. They give their angle on how you can deal with things. And we very quickly hear how things are on the ground right now. We were later today in the US, Denver, Colorado. We were in New York the other day. We were in Washington, D.C. We were in London. So it's a good experience. But the context is, how do I lead myself, my family, my people through this difficult time? And today we'll hear a lot about courage. So Dina, welcome all the way from Melbourne.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Dina, let's kick off. Quickly, how are things on the ground there? I guess it's different per region in Australia, but in Melbourne and Australia, I mean, what's it like?
Yeah, we are in self-isolation and we have been for approximately 2.5 weeks. What does that mean? We're only allowed out of the house for 4 reasons. 1 is to exercise, 2 is to go and buy food, 3 is for essential services, so if you need to go to a bank or anything like that, and the 4th reason is for compassionate reasons. So, for example, I am leaving the house on Thursday because I need to take my mum to the bank, so I'm allowed to do that. But we actually have police on the roads who are stopping people and asking them why they are leaving their suburbs and why they're not home, and they're issuing fines as well.
So if your story isn't good enough, your excuse isn't good enough. I have a friend who lives in Brisbane and with a big family on a big plot of land, and he was very impressed with how your president, or you call your president, I forget.
Prime Minister.
How your Prime Minister handled this. And he referred very particularly to the need for all citizens to kind of adopt an older citizen, an older person who might be very lonely at this time, for example, and it could be one's mother, I guess, or anyone else. And I absolutely admire that. That impressed me, is that 4th reason, compassionate reason. I mean, it just means that let's not lose our value system while we're going through this unprecedented experience.
Absolutely. And, you know, for me, it's also, I'm very excited to be going to see my mum on Thursday, because actually I haven't seen her for 4 weeks because I was a little unwell. And then we've been in isolation for 2.5 weeks, and I normally see my mum every week, and so I haven't seen her for about 4 weeks, so I'm very grateful for it. And it is very much about even, you know, leaving letters in people's letterboxes in the street saying, let me know, is there anything I can do for you? Can I go do your shopping for you? You know, what can I do? If you're unable to do it, let me know. So it's very much about community. It's very much really looking out for each other.
Well, we're on lockdown 21 days. We're on day 12 now, so another 9 days, and maybe we'll get that that kind of angle from our leadership, you know, after lockdown, and because I don't foresee a full scale back to normal, of course not. Okay, Dina, wonderful. I think it's a fabulous example of leadership. In fact, right now as we speak about it, that one would add a little angle like that, a compassionate reason. I'm very impressed. All right, now, you talk about courage a lot. You had a conference recently. You teach and preach it. Just tell us the angle that you come from, why you focus so much on that word called courage. I think we can all make logical deductions, but give us your angle, and then after that, we'll discuss it in the context of our world right now.
Sure. So for me, it all started when I was studying my Masters of Applied Positive Psychology. And in a group assignment, we were tasked with exploring what this thing called courage was. And when you look through the literature, when you look at the science, it's very much about physical courage. So we often associate courage with Firefighters, first responders, if we think of today and we think of our healthcare professionals, they're demonstrating physical courage because they're actually putting their physicality at risk in helping someone else. But what I found was there wasn't a lot about courage in workplaces. At the same time, one of our offerings is developing authentic leadership. And what I found at the time is that people would leave our programs, participants would leave, and they would be absolutely committed to being their best authentic self. But in subsequent programs and coaching, we would often hear that there were barriers to being authentic. So either the organisation didn't truly value authenticity, or there were competing demands, different stakeholders had different expectations, competitive marketplaces. And so I asked the question, well, what do you think that is about? And the word risk kept coming up. And at the same time, I was speaking to CEOs, managing directors of various organisations, and just asking them, how's your team performing? What are they doing really well? What's not going so well? And for all the reasons, for all the things that weren't going so well, they kept bringing up this word. They think it's a risk to do X, Y, Z. They think it's a risk to implement ABC. So this word risk kept coming up. And I thought, well, how do we combat risk? Well, we are courageous. And in being courageous, we're actually taking on the risk and actually acting even though we may be feeling vulnerable with that risk. And so my whole passion for courage was just heightened. And ever since then, I have devoted a lot of my time to building courage.
Okay, so in other words, if I understand you correctly, practically in a work environment, I know that I need to report that possible fraudulent behavior, but the risk of doing that and being victimized, or I know that my boss, my leader is exceptionally autocratic and damaging people's spirit and emotional being and so on, but the risk to confront him or her and talk about this is just too high. Again, victimization, losing jobs and things. Is that what you're saying? So the word risk comes up a lot, including strategy. We need to, as a business, take this step. We need to make a call on this, but the risk is just too high. We know it's the right thing, but the reputational risk or this or that. Is that it?
Yes. Absolutely. And, it's some big things, and it's also the smaller things too. It might be the risk to say, I need to take the day off tomorrow to take my mum to the bank. How is my manager, how's my leader going to respond to that? It might be the risk of actually saying, and this is probably a big thing, I'm going to make the decision not to be tied to my job anymore because this job doesn't allow me to be the best version of myself. So there's lots of different situations, and in fact we've put together a workplace courage questionnaire which is currently being analysed, and we had to limit it to 35 workplace situations because there are so many situations that carry risk. We just don't always think of it that way. And the thing I need to be really clear about, what I may consider I need to be courageous about, you may not. Courage is very subjective. What I consider to be risky could be very different to what you consider to be risky, and vice versa.
So as a leader, maybe, or as an individual, we're all leaders in our own right. I think maybe one could say whenever you want to do something, but you realize at that given moment that there is a certain risk involved, then you should ask yourself, am I not doing it because of a lack of courage because of the risk, or am I not doing it because the risk placed against my values or whatever? So let's take your Prime Minister. Again, I think that call to say people must be self-isolate, or people must sort of a semi-lockdown. I don't know if you call that, but let's add a fourth one, cabinet colleagues. Let's add the fourth one of saying for compassionate reasons. Then of course some would say, well, there's a risk there. What about if someone goes and helps their mom and makes their mom sick and the mom dies? Yeah. It would not have happened if we didn't add the fourth one. Okay, yes, it is a risk, but I think we must implement courage or show courage to do that so that we don't lose our humanity as a society at this moment, and the need to be in social isolation maybe, but still social connection still there. So you know, that's how you can play around with risk versus courage in reality. So let's make it real for our current situation. Can you talk to the leaders and the human beings out there and say, how do I apply this courageous principle in my life right now? How do I develop that courage?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things in that. You know, when we think again about courage being subjective, I may need courage to make a decision about self-isolating when my friends may not be taking it as seriously as I am. I may need courage to trust that my team are being productive when they're working at home. You know, I may need courage to make the decision to actually ask my team to still come into the office, even when the Prime Minister has said, if you can work from home, work from home. So even today, there's different reasons with COVID-19 that we may need courage. And, you know, as you've said, there is a risk in my going to see my mum. There's no doubt about it. And my husband and I have spoken at length about this. And I'm comfortable with the risk I'm taking because we have actually been in self-isolation for about almost 4 weeks because, as I said, I was unwell, just with common cold. But we've spoken at length about it. And this is one of the things that we encourage our clients to think about. When you're thinking about taking action and when you're feeling that there is a risk involved and you're feeling a bit vulnerable about it, actually stop and think and actually ask yourself 3 questions. The first question is, how worthwhile is this act? You know, from not at all worthwhile to extremely worthwhile. Having thought about how worthwhile the action is, then have a think about, well, what's the risk associated? Not at all risky, very risky. And there's no magic formula here, but if I've stopped to think about how worthwhile it is, if I've stopped to think about how risky it is, I'm then making an informed decision. And that keeps me encouraged because we know whilst courage is this beautiful, amazing strength, it has a tipping point to cowardice and it has a tipping point to recklessness. And what we want to do is remain in courage. So we encourage people to stop and think.
Okay, and what you think about are those 2 angles. The first one is, how important is this, or what's the word you use? How valuable?
How worthwhile.
Worthwhile would this be, or this behavior? And the second one is, how risky exactly? What are the risks? And then I can, in an informed way, decide, okay, it requires courage to do, or it requires courage not to do.
Yes. Absolutely. Sometimes it requires courage to not take action.
Okay, so I think people might think that courage is a very natural, instinctive thing. You have it or you don't, or you it's part of your personality or not. Or how do I actually develop it? Just like empathy, like being patient and kind and strong, and I don't know. What do you tell people that say developing courage seems to be, what helps me become more courageous? What components must I implement, adopt, bring into my life?
So there's 2 pieces I'm going to share with you. One is actually from my work. What I have found from interviewing many, many people is that, in fact, we all have courage within. We just don't often think about it. What we know from a neuroscience point of view is that our brain is constantly collecting data and making sense of our experiences. And it's collecting data so that when we're faced with a similar experience in our future, we can actually call on our past experience to behave in a particular way. And we know this all happens in a split second. It's all at the subconscious level. So what I'm doing with my own work is I'm asking people to reflect on when they've been courageous in the past and to really pull that apart and explore it. What were you doing? Who were you doing with? What were the conditions? Who enabled you? What were the outcomes? How did it make you feel? So what you're doing, instead of your brain doing this at a subconscious level, you're doing this at an intentional conscious level, and you're collecting metadata on yourself of when you've been courageous in the past that you can then apply in future and access it relatively easily when you need to be courageous in future. So that's one thing that we're doing. The other thing that I'm encouraging people to do is spot courage in other people. So if you see someone being courageous, actually call it out and actually be very specific in that, Because what we also find is people go, really? Was that courageous?
Mm.
And once we get into the detail of it, they actually go, oh, you know, now that I think about it and you've said it like that, it was pretty courageous because there was risk associated and I felt vulnerable in it. So they're two pieces of our own work. The other piece of work that I'll just share very briefly with you, I had the absolute pleasure and delight of being accredited by Dr. Brené Brown in her work around courage. And Dr. Brené Brown's work around courage, and she's worked with 400,000 participants and, you know, over 20 years, she's found that there's 4 key skills to build courage. One is to rumble with vulnerability. The next one is to live in your values, and you've already spoken a lot about how, you know, the importance of our values. The third skill is to build trust, or brave trust, as she calls it, and the fourth skill is to build resilience. So in our practice, we combine Brené's work with our own work to build courage in individuals.
Okay, Dina, we're at a time now in the history of the world where leaders have to be courageous on so many levels. They've got to be courageous and confront their own egos, their own pride. They've got to be courageous in revisiting or rethinking their organizations and how it will plug back into this new world.
Yeah.
They have to revisit their own value system, how much they value people versus shareholder value, you know, in terms of, are we now going to focus on becoming back to, returning back to profitability at the cost of letting our people go? Some people have to have the courage to close their businesses and move on. Small businesses are obviously being destroyed all over the world. I mean, wow, how relevant. I think it's always been relevant, your specific emphasis, Dina, but how much more relevant it is right now. And that's why I'm really excited that we didn't interview earlier. You know, a few months ago we were going to, and here we are doing it right now. Again, there's a reason for things at all times. So my message to leaders are to listen carefully to what you've said today, even though it's a short interview. But I want you to, because we can expand a great deal, and they can go and look you up if they need to, obviously, in today's
Absolutely.
world. But I want you to give them a message of courage, a message of what they need to do in their own lives, in their families set up, in their businesses and organizations, political leaders. You know, if Trump or your own prime minister or Vladimir Putin or Cyril Ramaphosa, my president, was watching this, what would you say to them?
Apologies to Gandhi, but I would say be the courage you want to see in the world. To sit with the tension of feeling vulnerable, sit with the tension of possibly being fearful, and really being guided by your values to make courageous decisions.
Okay. Dina, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you.
Dina Pozzo, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. She is a facilitator, coach, speaker, and she challenges leaders to be courageous in opening their door and seeing the other side of them. And what a valuable conversation. I look forward to sharing it with the world. And thank you for the good work you're doing to try and build more authentic leaders. And I love what you said in the beginning, developing a leader to become more authentic. Eventually you would need courage to be that person. You'd need courage to implement those very traits or characteristics that you aspire to. And one could argue an authentic leader cannot be authentic without courage. There's just no way you can be. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for helping me spread the word on courage.
And all the best in Australia with the reality that we face.
And you too, absolutely. All the best to everyone who's listening.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.